Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elizabeth Spalding.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My internet search history probably looks a lot like yours, but there's a significant outlier in mine that most wouldn't know. It's Marxists.org. This website has much more than everything ever written by Karl Marx. It's a veritable cornucopia of communists and their writings. Why Marxist.org? The obvious answer is that I'm chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and I'm a professor who teaches the American presidency, politics, foreign policy, and also the Cold War and Marxism. The deeper answer behind that obvious answer is that communism is the most destructive ideology that mankind has ever seen. It is responsible for the deaths of easily more than 100 million souls, and it's hundreds of millions more if you add in forced abortions. Further, communism is alive and well. We need to understand that communism continues to make victims, both dead and alive, even as we are meeting here, and that's in 5 self-professed one-party communist states and other socialist countries, including Venezuela and Nicaragua, in our own hemisphere. Communism also threatens our beloved country from both without and within, and thus our families, friends, and fellow citizens. Bill Buckley, we're celebrating Bill Buckley, WFB 100, and National Review more broadly understood the challenge of modern times as communism versus freedom. Communism came first in this epic struggle, not because it is correct or superior, but because it is a monstrous aggressor. Note that communism's target is freedom, not just our God-given natural rights or democracy or free enterprise. American writer and former Soviet spy Whittaker Chambers, a close friend of Buckley's, made this central point in his masterpiece, Witness, and then in his subsequent writings for National Review in the early days and in correspondence with Buckley. Chambers stressed that the fight between communism and freedom was a civilizational matter, a political, philosophical, and theological battle. He wasn't even sure if the West could win. Many Americans agreed with this view in the 1940s and the 1950s before the advent of National Review. They did not always agree on tactics and policy, but they agreed in general terms about what was at stake in the Cold War. And this includes even what we might term old lowercase l liberals, not the capital L liberals that Buckley would dissect and decimate in Up From Liberalism and other writings. And one of these old small l liberals in the 1940s and into the 1950s was Ronald Reagan. And as Chambers was Buckley's chief witness in the civilizational struggle, Reagan would become, in important ways, Buckley's political partner in the fight against communism for freedom. Then, as president, Reagan would become peerless in reaching and teaching America, and after that, the West. Along the way, Reagan also encouraged and emboldened dissidents and others behind the Iron Curtain as his strategy of peace through strength helped to bring down the Soviet Empire and free millions of people. Buckley identified the threat from communism and collectivism as central to modern times. And he put together an all-star cast at National Review to be the constant and loud when needed voice of conscience in the Cold War. There were stars like Buckley himself and Chambers. There were also offstage stars, not at National Review, but who were influenced by and influenced and are, like Reagan. There was also an offstage main character who only came to America in the 1970s and stayed for less than 2 decades. This was Russian writer and dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And he's known most famously for being the author, as probably most of you here know, the Gulag Archipelago, and before that, One Day in the Life of Ivan Dezinovich. I believe that more than one Buckley family member commented on how Solzhenitsyn was quoted and published or in reference so often in National Review that they could have even changed the name to the Solzhenitsyn Review. Solzhenitsyn was part of NR's life force, echoing, and then in the time that he was writing, going beyond what Chambers had done, and also because of his experiences. Solzhenitsyn was a witness and voice of conscience who said, "Live not by lies," and forever kept the focus on that central struggle between freedom and communism. For him, as for Buckley and Reagan, this was a manifestation of the perpetual battle between truth and freedom and totalitarianism, which reflected the human condition. Solzhenitsyn's famous line from the Gulag Archipelago, which more than one NR editor could quote from memory, resonated. The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. But don't we know that in the 1980s, the anti-communist pro-freedom coalition that Bill Buckley helped to forge was successful in Ronald Reagan? Didn't that happen? The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union collapsed, the West won the Cold War. In Margaret Thatcher's immortal phrase about Reagan, can we all quote it together? "He won the Cold War without firing a shot." Why then are we still talking about communism? Why am I chairman of a nonprofit organization called the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation that has to educate all generations and address the present and the future, not just remember and chronicle the past? There are many reasons, and I will highlight 3 here. 1, we won the Cold War, but communism didn't end. The ideology was rejected in Eastern and Central Europe, but it has lived on in Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. We didn't root out the ideology. The ism remains attractive to too many. The West was magnanimous in victory, which is all to the Churchillian good. But this generosity should have been toward people and their future democratic governments, not the ideology and its regimes. Part of our current problem with Russia is that Vladimir Putin was formed back in the USSR, so to speak. You can do a lot of damage with the pernicious communist leftovers in a revisionist regime that wants to destroy the West and the liberal order. You can do even more damage when a couple of your comrades in arms to reshape and run the world are still communist states themselves. 2, the ideology, the ism, is the key. To its core, communism is opposed to all that we hold true and believe and base self-government on in the West, generally, and America specifically. In communism, there is no authentic freedom and equality, no rights, no rule of law or constitutionalism. Communism rejects what is transcendent. It is based on atheism. Then it makes of itself a new God, embodied in the party and the state. Communism says it will make a new man, seeing human nature as totally malleable. Communism's end is to remake man and his environment, state and society. As a result, communism's end justifies the means and tools that you associate with the former Soviet Union, today's communist countries, and elements of movements we face in the United States. The ism has also had legs. The high water mark of communism, according to the numbers, was approximately 1/3 of the world's population in 1980. But long after the end of the Soviet Empire, communism's adaptability has contributed to its staying power. The philosophical parts, from Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School to Antonio Gramsci, even came here over the years, whether in person or on the page, and found a nice, warm place to nest on top of previous inroads made in our universities by political philosophy from Hegel, Rousseau, and others. Then they propagated. Think of it like a bad family tree with various discrete branches and twigs going back to Papa Marx. Communism has received help from other isms. The ideology delights in secularism and relativism as long as you are absolute about communism. Throw in some help from Nietzsche and others, and nihilism becomes communism's ally, just as anarchism was in the battles of words and arms in the 20th century in Russia, China, and elsewhere. And don't forget, the ideology is totalitarian in its strength, and its strength is projected as unassailable. 3, communism is based on lies. Too many lack knowledge about communism, or they get misinformation, even disinformation. Despite all our efforts, we have not done the kind of educating that those who say never forget about the Holocaust have done and still do. Too many Americans accept what they hear. Today, that is worse than ever, since we have multiple generations, not just young people, getting their so-called facts on smartphones. Because communism has an end, albeit the wrong end, it is very motivated. It seeks out its end. Too many of us fail to be vigilant. We are complacent and comfortable. What do we need to do? And I will not say what is to be done, because that's a title by Vladimir Lenin. What do we need to do? I'm looking forward to soon talking with Noah about this part and more. To get us started, here are a few thoughts. We need more of what National Review did in the 1950s. NR built on the best of the Cold Warriors of the 1940s and early 1950s. It was created, in part, to stand athwart peaceful coexistence. Buckley and his all-star cast grasped that the Kremlin defined peaceful coexistence the same way they would détente in the 1960s and 1970s, as cover to do pretty much whatever they wanted, short of hot war between the superpowers. In this regard, President Dwight Eisenhower came in for strong criticism by Buckley and NR. In his pursuit of symmetry in advance of what would turn into full détente in the following decade, Eisenhower at times seemed to put a somewhat vague concept of peace above or before real peace grounded in freedom. And in their criticism, Buckley and National Review served as the voice of conscience, the beacon of truth in this epic struggle for freedom against communism. We also need to avoid a repeat of the 1960s and 1970s, those weaknesses toward, confusion about, and misunderstanding of communism and the Cold War. Détente meant that the United States compromised, succumbed, and even gave up, in effect, a strategic surrender to the Soviet Union, and whether wittingly or unwittingly, to the People's Republic of China. Buckley and National Review consistently exposed the problems with détente and helped to educate and invigorate the future Reagan revolution for freedom in the 1980s. What we face now is akin to a combination of the threats from the 1930s and 1940s and the 1970s. We cannot lose sight of out there, of abroad, and we cannot lose sight of here at home. For all that we ripped ourselves apart in America in the 1960s and 1970s, we still had many who resisted. NR was part of that resistance too. A healthy patriotic core remains in America today, but it is more stressed than ever before. We must reinforce and rebuild, and without being hagiographic in any way, we need to build in principled ways on what worked best under Reagan in the 1980s, under the circumstances we currently face, and in the conditions that we are attempting to shape. The threats are many and serious. Unfortunately, communism isn't so last century or 19th century. It's the adaptable ism with legs that confronts and challenges us abroad and at home. My bottom line recommendation: no strategic surrender, whether de facto or future, to either the enemy without or the enemy within. Those enemies are friends with each other, not just because the enemy of your enemy may be your friend, but because they develop in their respective ways from the same source and want to go to the same place. Ye shall be as gods. This is Whittaker Chambers quoting Genesis in Witness, referring to man's timeless temptation to power in communism's ideological project. The communist vision is the vision of man without God, he also said. So, reject that timeless temptation and join the fight for freedom. As Buckley and National Review stated many times, no compromise with peaceful coexistence. And as Reagan said before his presidency and then acted on in the 1980s, we win, they lose. On that note, let's go to some discussion.
So we should give Elizabeth Spalding the introduction she deserves. In addition to being the chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, she is also on the board of the Institute of Religion and Democracy and a senior fellow at Pepperdine University's School of Public Policy, as well as a visiting fellow at Hillsdale College's Van Andel School of Government. Thank you so much for being here. So you're an educator. You talk about communism with the upcoming generation, which seems to many, I imagine, a remote concept, sort of an anachronistic idea. What challenges do you encounter when you're trying to educate the younger generation beyond simply what all educators encounter, like attention deficit issues?
That's right. That's right.
And how do you zero in on the notion that communism equals bad?
Right. So it is a challenge, and for some of the reasons you've already outlined. And then we're also starting with whether I'm teaching master's students or speaking to undergraduates or high school students, they know nothing. So you can just start over all the time, but it means you can only get so far in whatever the time is that you have with the students. So that's definitely a challenge. It's just a practical challenge. But then trying to get them to be interested and ultimately to care, because so much of how they're getting education now is about feelings.
Yeah.
Is a challenge. And I have found that I have to find examples that there's somebody around their age it happened to. Or imagine that you are a student in China and you're not allowed to do this, that, or that. And that starts penetrating. And then when I use the numbers, and I break down the numbers of those who have been killed by communism further in a lot of those kinds of talks, they might start nodding. When they hear that more people have been killed by communism than in both world wars combined, they're still learning something about the world wars, so that can make some sort of effect. And then I appeal to their understanding of low freedom, of what, they want to do what they want to do. So when they realize that there's not even the proper understanding of freedom in communism, but also a lot of the low freedoms are not allowed, then they start paying more attention.
So,
but you're trying to get their attention.
Right. So I don't even know what your experience is along these lines. There's a couple of arguments, obviously, many arguments against communism, but some of them are less controversial than others. The least controversial, in my view, I don't know, you can correct me, is the economic inefficiency of it. The rejection of prices as a mechanism to convey information, the inefficient allocation of resources, the quota systems in which enterprise managers would either just meet the quota or completely not meet the quota in observance of next year's quota. But all of this is fits within the framework of the moral argument against communism. You see individuals as cogs in a machine, as instruments to be wielded by the state. And the Soviets had a really great cognitive mechanism where they could render elementary ethical precepts anathema because they originated in the capitalist world. They're therefore instruments of control and invalidated. And so the sort of philosophical pragmatism that was practiced by the Soviets allowed for grotesque abuses of human rights and just the subversion of the human spirit and rejection of the idea of the human spirit. But if you're steeped in a world of moral relativism, that can be a hard argument to make. You can make that, well, it's not as efficient as capitalism, but how efficient is capitalism really? So once you dispense with the moral argument, you get a very muddied case against international socialism.
Yes, you do. But that's part of the reason why I said it's important to build on, and I'm not doing this to just say whatever Reagan said was right, whatever Reagan did was right. But
Goes without saying.
He never said that it wasn't, he never said that communism was moral. And he was consistent on this. And he was using his time, especially in the presidency, but even before then in his radio addresses in the 1970s, to educate people about why in the end, when we're talking about a form of government, that you have to include the moral element. So that's a longer term project, I know it's that. But then also there are good economists who talk about how the free market, free enterprise, and capitalism, I mean, it's not an ism the same way that communism is, have all been so much more successful. There are some good scholars on even how when Mao Zedong gets credit for bringing the People's Republic of China out of poverty, there have been some who have done work who have shown, well, if he hadn't done it that way, if he had done it more with the market, it would be a better outcome and you wouldn't have had tens of millions of people dead.
Your organization, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, teaches what you've described as the 3 R's in relation to international communism. They are revolution, repression, and resistance. Can you explain a little? I mean, I can put those in Soviet history, in my mind, in periods of Soviet history, but I imagine there's a broader application of this framework.
Right. When we were making our museum, please come visit when you're in Washington. We're on McPherson Square, not far from the White House. But when we were making the museum, we knew we needed something that was helping people understand the victims, and that meant that you had to have enough history so that people understood why they were victims and are victims of communism, and also that you had some themes that you were tracing throughout. So we just settled on these 3 R's, and revolution captures many things, but probably just to say here is that communism is a revolutionary ideology. That's part of why it's radical, and it can't just stay still. And so that starts in practice with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, but it's even right there in Marx from the beginning of modern communism. So that's revolution. And then repression, I mean, we talked about this already a little bit. The communists are not basing anything on a proper understanding of human nature and what we are. And so they're trying to remake everything. And so they have to repress everything that's natural to man, everything that we long for, try to achieve, it ends up being repressed. So the repression part we trace all the way through, not only at the museum, but in many of our educational materials. But then we don't want to lose sight of the fact that communism is the alien ideology. It is the wrong thing. It it is the thing that we want, especially young people, but everybody to reject. So resistance shows that you've got this human nature, this human spirit that does long for freedom, and we trace that through too. And from the beginning, there are those who resist communism. So even as Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks are doing the coup and making communism, they in Russia, which will become Soviet Russia, then the USSR, there are people from different walks of life, not just religious, who are resisting communism and who become some of the very first victims. But we wanted to capture that. You can't understand what happens over time if you don't understand that there is resistance to it at all the costs. And I gave you examples too. You know, somebody like Solzhenitsyn,
right.
He's resisting forever.
How do you define or keep your terms sharply defined? Not all young people are aspiring fellow travelers. There are plenty of young people who reject the left, reject Marxism, reject Leninism, but they all have definitions that these young people may not strictly adhere to, ascribing Marxism to anything they don't like, which
right.
can be conventional democratic politics, which is not true,
right.
and would yield mission creep in the organizations that were founded to combat communism.
Right.
How do you make sure that you keep these young people who are on your side intellectually, curious at least, but don't necessarily know these definitions and may be seduced by a culture that wants to expand the definition of Marxist-Leninism to mean everything they just don't like?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, part of this is we want to encourage good education and discussion on a variety of topics, including this one, so that we have well-educated young people who are able to think, who have read, and then understand what they're hearing and seeing, right? So we want that. In terms of the particular, especially for Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, we focus a lot on actual curriculum. We have a high school curriculum. We have several new curriculum items coming out, including one that will be for 4th through 6th graders. We have another one that's more in between. It can scale up to high school as well. And then we even have one of our associates at VOC has done a children's book. So we're really trying to reach all different ages. And it's the stories that draw people in. So the curriculum that I've just mentioned, very important. It gives young people facts. But we also have Witness Project videos and podcasts. And the Witness Project videos, I find, are one of the most important ways to reach the younger generations. Because if they're seeing that's a real person that happened to, and oh, that's not good, then I don't want that. And then they want to know more.
What would you say the state of the international communist revolution, such as it is today, is? You know, we have moribund states, rogue states that subscribe in some fashion or form to Marxist-Leninism. China seems to pick a la carte its tenets of Marxist-Leninism, but Xi is re-Sovietizing the economy, re-centralizing the economy, perhaps to his economy's detriment, but to his own, to augment his own power. Is China interested in exporting the revolution anymore?
I think China is interested, but it shows again this both the ism and then the adaptability of the ism. So there are some things that you can see that Marxist-Leninists have done for a long time, but there are other things that you go ahead and you say, okay, well, the Cubans are helping us do something in an African country. That's exporting the revolution, but it's not necessarily doing it the same way, although the Soviets did that too, and the Chinese did that too. So, I mean, there are some things that are still the same. But I think that the point is that China has always said that it's going to be taking over the world as a communist country. And then people thought, oh, they didn't do it yet. And they weren't ready to do it. And now they've been trying to acquire more and more power so that they're more equipped to do it. I don't know what Xi Jinping's personal endgame is, other than he does want to stay in power, and he believes in Marxism, Leninism, Maoism.
I want to talk about the instruments that the West and the United States in particular can use to arrest the spread of communism. But just to zero in on probably one of the more controversial issues, we heard Brent Bozell earlier talk about the shuttering, or the attempted shuttering of the U.S. Agency for Global Media and institutions like the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, and Radio Marti, which attempts to pierce the authoritarian bubble around Cuba. I think conservatives have a very valid point insofar as you see creeping PBS and PRism in these institutions, which don't necessarily advance our interests. However, the existence of these efforts to pierce this impenetrable bubble that the captive peoples of the world inhabit is a valuable enterprise, and to have nothing would seem to betray the individuals who have stories saying, yeah, I caught a Radio Free Liberty broadcast and it inspired me to emigrate at great personal peril, or inspired me to become a dissident. I mean, those stories are hard to overlook. So have these instruments outlived their usefulness, or are we just being short-sighted?
I don't think they've outlived their usefulness. I think we are being short-sighted. I think we have to separate it from how do we make government work better, how do we make it more efficient, how do we make it more limited, from getting rid of these particular institutions. Part of what worked so well in the American strategy of containment from start to finish, because VOA starts during World War II, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty are added in the Truman era and then are bolstered during the Eisenhower era, and then jumping ahead, Ronald Reagan adds some more and also really pumps it up. But what's common to all of that is that you're not doing one thing against communism. We have to have strength of all different kinds, and part of that strength is going to be information strength, and that goes to this. And maybe it's also kind of an emotional strength, because we are living in this era where so many, especially young people, it's all about feelings. And so they have to be touched somehow to realize, okay, this is an issue that's important. And though, again, so much of what, I mean, you know, you look up things on Radio Free Europe, for example, or Radio Asia, you can get a fact-based story, and then you can get a great story about a person. They'll still have facts in it, but it makes it personal. You get both of those on the same site.
When you're talking to young people, do you draw a distinction between socialism and communism, as they often do? Or is it sort of a poison is determined by the dose sort of thing?
Probably more the latter, although I always point out that for Marx and Engels and for Lenin, there's no difference. You're kind of on the way to full communism, but socialism is communism. So I make sure in my teaching that the students understand that. But I do talk about with young people that there's an understanding of socialism that people use that differs from communism, where there's control of the major industries, but not as many, you know, that it tends to deal more with what's in the public eye, that it's not exactly full communism, and that some of these countries are not necessarily on the road to a Venezuela now or one of the remaining communist countries still.
Speaking of Venezuela and its primary sponsor in Cuba, there is a misconception that the communist threat is either in the distant past or in the foreseeable but sort of distant future. Senate Republicans recently alleged, I think in terms about as explicit as you possibly can, that the anomalous health incidents we refer to as Havana syndrome, which are functionally attacks on US diplomatic personnel in Cuba, were state-based attacks. And we don't know what the Cuban intelligence services were responsible for that, or the Russians, for example, who have a presence on the island. But it's quite plain that this was an attack on the US government by a communist agent to advance international communism. What am I missing?
You're not missing anything. I'm amazed how much Cuba gets a pass. Now, if we were in Florida and we had a number of Cuban Americans with us, they would tell us, okay, we're never giving it a pass. But you go out and about in the United States, and so many times people, they still like the allure of, I don't know if it's the island culture, they've seen a Che Guevara t-shirt, whatever it is, they give Cuba a pass, and they don't understand that even past the Castro brothers, Cuba's still Cuba. It's still communist. And for a small place, it's had a lot of action and support of other.
Punches far above its weight.
Yes, yes. It really does punch above its weight.
And has altered the course of 20th century
Yes.
history in
Yes.
profoundly deleterious ways.
Yes. You're not exaggerating.
I know my stuff. You have cited the need for improved cultural products, movies, television, film, what have you, that treat communism as the menace it is, and talk about it as what it is, truthfully. And also a renewed emphasis on basic civic education to combat the threat. Do you believe that's sufficient, or is this just starting point? And if it is just a starting point, how do we get to the next step? Because that alone seems like a daunting task.
Right. I think it may be a starting point, and I would hope it would be sufficient, but I don't know that it's sufficient. So this would be going back to having people have, their basic education, but then learning about this too. And I think that when I'm encountering, a lot of young people now are getting more and more of their facts. It's not like this didn't happen before, but they're getting more and more of their facts from watching a movie or a streaming show or even something very quick online, and they think that's a fact about something. So we do need to venture into the culture more, do all sorts of kind of programming, including streaming series and movies. And then I think we're just gonna have to make sure we're not only telling a great story, but have real facts in it. You have to figure out now where you're taking the dramatic liberties, because if you do too many, then these young people are gonna think that that was actually what happened.
Right.
And then I also think what is on the page, if you all have children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, godchildren who still read, then there's a growing literature of young adult fiction, and it's not enough, but there are some good books now and a couple of graphic novels that are fact-based, but they draw the reader in through a story. And so some people are looking at, again, what some of us here might remember growing up reading with respect to World War II and the Holocaust in the way of memoirs and fiction, fact-based fiction that were geared toward middle school and the beginning of high school.
So young adult fiction, are there specific examples of anything in the mass popular culture that you think really does the subject well?
No, I'm seeing. No, I don't. I mean, I think. So there are a couple of movies out there that are good. The Poles had, until recently, I don't know what they have now in the pipeline for movies, but they've done some very good movies that are Cold War communism based. But you have to read the subtitles. Often it presumes you know a lot more history than young people here would. So maybe we adapt some of that to American versions, just like we take all these shows from Britain and redo them. That could be one way to go. I do think if you're looking for a very good book to give that tween to young teen age, there's a book called First I Must Betray You, and it takes place in Romania in 1989. And the main character is a young boy who the secret police bring him in and they say, you have to help turn in family members. And it's gripping.
Wait till they find out what happens to Ceausescu.
Yes, it's gripping. It's gripping. So that's one book. I recommend all the time that young people read One Day in the Life of Ivan Dezinovich by Solzhenitsyn. It's accessible, and then that can be a gateway opening to them eventually reading the Gulag Archipelago and other important writings by Solzhenitsyn. And then some of his essays, including, I mean, probably everybody here at some point has read the Harvard Address, but just the short essay that he had released when he was being sent into exile from the Soviet Union in 1974, that is excellent for high school age. So that's fact-based, but it's gripping. It starts, why is he writing this? You just start with those kinds of questions. I would bring back dinner table conversations. I assume you all are doing that. But we need to have things going on formally in the classroom and then in families too. I mean, that's part of this, taking back the culture.
I think we have time for questions from the audience, one or two.
All right. Our first question is the Communist International still as active as it was in the 1960s and 70s? During the Vietnam War, Students for a Democratic Society and documents from communist groups in other countries were verbatim identical.
All right. Excellent question. It's not the same as that period, and it pops up from time to time, so it makes you wonder what's going on that we don't know about, and I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist. But there were elements, like during the combination of COVID and Black Lives Matter, where you would still see some very similar language between somebody who said they were a committed Marxist and then something that was written, and then you'd find out that somebody really was still in touch with Marxists. So there are aspects of that, but it's not as systemic and systematic as it was. And people protest differently now than they did in the past. But what's out there is kind of it's in the water. Like a lot of times people will use things that are, if they're not actually communists, they are friendly to communism, and they don't realize that they're talking that way.
I think we might have time for one more.
Yeah, and this is a follow-up to what you just said, Elizabeth, which is, did we beat communism in the Cold War but lose it at Harvard and Yale?
Yeah. And now that they're getting rid of DEI at some of these schools, that's going to fix everything, right? There's always work to do. I think that I have too much to say on this topic, but the short answer would be, in part, we lost at elite universities like that. And in part, it's because communism was passed down from graduate school mentor to graduate school mentee, and then a number of those students end up back at the elite institutions, teaching it, adapting it, turning it into various aspects of critical theory or whatever else. I mean, you get that, I said the ugly, wrong family tree, the twisted family tree. And so that's all there. That all needs to be rooted out. But I think that, although I wish people had stayed more awake longer, people woke up in these last several years about the cancel culture and then COVID and other shutdowns and just that people are more aware of it than ever. And I'm running into people, not just conservatives, who are encouraging their own children to not go to such schools.
I don't know, I'm hijacking this again.
Sure.
I don't know if you have this experience, but it is something that triggers somebody like me. When I'll hear a linguistic signifier that I can identify as having a progeny that originates in Moscow, and that shuts me down. That's where I say, okay, well, you know where you're getting that from, and that is not a productive way to have an argument.
No, it isn't. It isn't. I think you want to instead talk with people who because sometimes it's unwitting. They don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the person is actually a committed communist, then you're going to have a different kind of conversation with them.
If you're trying to pitch me on dialectical materialism, though.
Right. And I've had conversations with people who they still think Lenin was a great guy. This is a problem if you think that Lenin was a great guy. But you counter that with facts, and then you know that you're probably not going to convert the communist, at least not in that conversation. But if it's people who are using some terms because their cool friend was using them or whatever, then you have an opening. You can have a good conversation with that person, and then the question is whether you want to, is that the one time you're talking with that person, or is it going to be a relationship? Is it somebody you know that you're going to be in contact with?
Sure. Elizabeth Spalding, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Going that way, right?